Okay, good morning, everyone. Good morning, good morning. So glad to see so many of you all out here. And thank you for attending the first Ed Talk of the spring semester. Sorry for those who are sitting behind the pillar. I'll try to do something like this while I'm talking. I want to thank our distinguished guests, those who flew in from around the nation yesterday, for being here. Two of my local colleagues who are doing some amazing work around attendance in the Austin area. So thank you for being here as well. All of whom I will introduce shortly. And for all of you for being here, both representing the College of Education in the University of Texas, districts around Central Texas. So I know we have Pflugerville ISD, Del Val, Austin ISD, all the rest of you all ISDs are here as well. Sorry if I didn't name your ISD. And then also to the greater Austin community. This should be a fabulous Ed Talk. My name is Joshua Childs, and I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Educational Leadership and Policy here in the College of Education. And so I want to give a little bit of background about what Ed Talks is. There's some flyers there. So Ed Talks was created by a group of us assistant professors that want to bring cutting-edge, cross-disciplinary perspectives on education and research to the College of Education community. I want to thank James. I asked him what his last name was, so I wouldn't butcher it. James Kustovsky, assistant professor in educational psychology, for leading those efforts. James is right there, so let's thank you, James. For leading those efforts for us assistant professors. Also want to thank my colleague, Dr. Huria Jabbar, assistant professor also in the Educational Leadership and Policy Department, who I've worked with the last few years on representing the Leadership and Policy Department at the Ed Talk. So Dr. Jabbar is right there. Thank you. And also, I'm hot, sorry for the sweating. And also Terrence Green, Dr. Terrence Green, also the assistant professor in Educational Leadership and Policy, who along with Huria started efforts underway in this department a few years ago to bring in speakers and guests and researchers who would be beneficial to our department and our students in the college as well. And so it's great now, I think this is the third year of the Ed Talk series, that we have been able to cut across departments and have different speakers, both locally or those who are representative of the college or the university, but also that we can bring people from across the nation to come and talk to you all. I would like to thank our sponsors, the Graduate School of at the University of Texas at Austin, the College of Education's Dean's Office, and in particular, Associate Dean Tasha Barethvis, who has been a supporter of our Ed Talks, for our efforts for the Ed Talks, and the Lippitt Centennial Lectureships that help fund the events for today. Around the room are some flyers that show you the lineup of Ed Talks that we'll have across throughout the spring semester that will be happening in the college. And we hope this isn't the last time that you come to one of these amazing events. And I will be sweating less at those. So I'll be back up in just a second to frame our event today and introduce our guests. But I'd like to invite Dr. Victor Sines, associate professor and chair of Educational Leadership and Policy Department, who will give some brief remarks and introduce the new dean of the College of Education, Charles Martinez.
Buenos dias. All right. Well, welcome to the UT Austin College of Education. Thank you, Josh. Thank you, Ria, James, Lauren, Terrence, and Absentia, and all the other junior faculty, assistant professors at this college who embarked and are leading on this journey to really enrich our understandings in cross-disciplinary, exciting ways. This is another opportunity to do that today. And I look around the audience and see a group of practitioners, of educators, of researchers, national, local, you name it. And this is the exact kind of blend that we thrive for and that we really benefit from. So I thank all of you for being here today. Also, a lot of our students are here, both graduate students, undergrads, you name it. So just the right space. And I think also, as I was saying earlier, the right time, because the College of Ed has been going through some significant changes, especially at the top with our leader. And so I'm here and really pleased to be able to welcome and introduce this morning our new dean, Dr. Charles Martinez, comes to us from the University of Oregon. He's a clinical psychologist by training, but he's been in education his entire academic career as a department chair, as a vice president at University of Oregon for diversity and equity and inclusion, and now, of course, as dean of our college. We lured him to Texas, I think, precisely because of spaces and opportunities like this, when we do bring together scholars, practitioners, researchers, educators, grassroots community folks. I see folks in the audience like Rocky and others have been doing this work for years and years on this particular topic. And I hope you see this space as you'll see and you hear from Dr. Martinez, because we got to show off, right, like we do in Texas, right? And help welcome him to this state, because he's also bringing with him many, many years of commitment to engaging directly with stakeholders and shareholders in this work, not only as an academic, as a researcher and faculty member at the University of Oregon, but also as a policymaker, as a member of the State Board of Education in the state of Oregon, and also as a locally elected school board member in a school district there. So he's somebody who is absolutely very much 1 foot in, 1 foot out. He's all, he's cloning himself. I don't know how he does it, but certainly we are so pleased to be able to welcome. So please help me welcome Dr. Shaun Martinez.
Good morning, everyone. Victor is right. This is like exactly what makes my heart sing. Looking at this audience, seeing our faculty, our students, our community partners working together on what are really important issues. This is why we exist as a college of education. So, and just what I need at the end of a very busy week. Yeah, right. I've just finished my first month, so that's like check mark. Survived the first month. I have gotten to learn Texas a lot. However, over the last 6 months, I've sort of been in transition from Oregon, and this topic today, I think, is among the most pressing topics we face in the country. So some years ago, in my work on the State Board of Education in Oregon, and as chair of the State Board, we really began looking in a really sharp way at our student success rate. And the impetus of that, I'm going to try to do the same thing. Let's take a peek around the column. Hi. But the impetus of that, in part, was sort of what was going on nationally in terms of our ranking and graduation rates. And as Oregon sort of began to slip further down in terms of four-year graduation rates at the state level, everyone starts getting alarmed. All the politicians do, all the state executives do. It's a big issue. And some of that had to do with like how we're measuring student success. And of course, what everyone does is look at test scores. That's what you're used to doing, look at summative assessment scores to tell the story. So we did that. We looked at those test scores. And of course, when you look at those test scores, you instantly start thinking about sort of the student level performance data. And there's a lot of storytelling to be had there. But the next big question was much more fundamental about what are some of the actual causal pathways. And so we started looking at things like absenteeism. And the first thing that we discovered in the state of Oregon is that we had an epidemic problem in terms of chronic absenteeism across the system, which was incredibly alarming, that no one was like, it's a fundamental thing. If students are not in school, we don't have any chance to do right by them. And there are lots of reasons that students are not in school. So that was a huge observation. But the second observation was even more important, which was that the variance in which students encountered the challenges of absenteeism was great, and it was different for different subgroups of students. So because of race, ethnicity, because of social disadvantage, geographic mobility, EL status, English learning status, these variables were associated with absenteeism. Now, a student's race should have nothing to do with going to school, right? It's not a causal predictor. The fact that we mark those differences make you think something you think about absenteeism is about something about the student. But it's not about the student, it's about the system. It's about what happens in the system and what students encounter in their communities and their family that they bring to the system and our inability to accommodate and engage them. It is a warning sign and a call to action that's profound inside our education system, and it's not about those students. So it's easy to move into sort of a deficit mindset, particularly when we think about absenteeism. This topic is so essential for what we're doing in education. It's particularly important at a scale in Texas that is hugely important. So this is a very relevant topic to what we're doing in Texas. Our teachers in the state of Texas are being the demand for differentiating instruction and responding to all sorts of challenges that students encounter, but also drawing from their assets. It's bigger than it's ever been in Texas, as we have a much more pluralistic student population. And the fact that we start seeing problems with absenteeism is a sign about our inability to properly arm teachers and leaders with the skills they need to better support their students. So this panel is an essential panel, and it's an essential discussion for us to have in this college and for the state. So I'm so thrilled that we're doing it. I'm so glad to be in the space and honored by our guests to help us think through this. So I need to let go now. I want to get right to the conversation, but thank you all for being here, and I look forward to the conversation.
So let's get right into it. We didn't have to hear 3 presentations that we're going to each define what chronic absenteeism. I thought it'd be useful to help frame so we're all on the same page as we move forward for the 3 presentations and then the community response afterwards. So what is chronic absence? Well, it's missing 10% or more of the school day or school year for any reason. That's including excused absences like being ill, unexcused absences, and including suspensions. All of these make up the definition of what it means to be chronically absent. So data shows that about 6 million students miss. It says 15, but it can be 10 days, 15 days or more of the school year each year. The data shows it can be as high as about 7.5 million students each school year. And so there's a significant number of students across the country that are chronically absent each year. And so why, for a lot of us researchers and policymakers and practitioners, like some of you all in this room, it's become vitally important to understand the reasons why students miss school and how do we help alleviate or curb the effects of chronic absenteeism. And I think it's also important to note that being chronically absent doesn't mean you're actually missing consecutive days, right? It can be as few as missing 1 day a month, and it adds up over time being 18 days over the school year or the 10%. So this is just to show you that it doesn't have to be every single day, but over the course of a school year, absences add up, which has profound effects, as we know, on academics and social and emotional issues. And so what we know from the research from one of our colleagues is that chronic absenteeism is affected by and affects these different zones of a student's daily life, right? So if we think about the students that we work with, or the students that we study, or the students that we try to create some positive policy around, we can see, if we think about it, we can see, right, chronic absence having some type of effect or being affected by each one of these conditions, whether it be the student's background, family background, the neighborhood context of which they come from or which they go to school in, the school environment, whether it be physical or social, and then the student's social, physical, and mental health all play or factor into being chronically absent. And so for a lot of us, we kind of talk about chronic absence as a problem hidden in plain sight, right? Because what we know is most states capture average daily attendance, right? So what is it as an indicator for student attendance during the school year? But what chronic absence has shown is that even schools that show 90%, 95% average daily attendance rates, you can still have a significant number of students who are chronically absent throughout the school year. So think of that calendar or that school year calendar that I showed earlier, right? Well, if on the day that you're capturing your ADA and that student isn't there or is there, right, it's not being captured over the course of the school year. So those students can be hidden in plain sight. And so hopefully today in this conversation, we're going to hear not only from our 3 distinguished guests, but also some community folks about what it means for students to be not only chronically absent, but what are some ways we can help curb or alleviate this issue. I push next. There we go. All right. So I want to give a couple shameless plugs to a few. Chronic absence is a hot issue now, and it's been for about the last 10 or so, maybe a little bit longer actually, 12 or so years, where people are really starting to be engaged in this work. And so there's a forthcoming book later this month called Absent from School, edited by 2 of our fabulous colleagues in other parts of the country, Michael Godfrey and Ethan Hutt. And 2 of our guests will have chapters in this book, and yours truly does as well. So it will be coming out later out this month, and it's an edited volume of chapters that talk about issues around chronic absence. You'll hear later from one of our speakers that will talk a little bit and touch on a little bit about their chapter in the book. Also, too, last spring, so about a year ago almost, a special issue, one of the first of its kind, in the Journal of Education for Students Placed at Risk, published a special issue on chronic absence. And all of our guests today have a paper in there. I've printed off copies that will be available up here for those of you all who are interested in reading some of those studies and findings. Also, too, if you email either the authors or myself, happy to send those to you as well. But in that special issue was the first of its kind that every single article or paper in that journal talked about the issue of chronic absenteeism and why it's so important for us, not only as researchers, but policymakers and practitioners, and why we must tackle and really focus in on this issue. And so, again, thank you for being here. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to I'm going to introduce our guest. So first, our first speaker will be Shaun Daughtery. He comes from us from the Vanderbilt University as an associate professor. Next, you'll hear from Kevin G., actually, who is an associate professor at the University of California, Davis. And then finally, you'll hear from Sarah Lenhoff, assistant professor at Wayne State University. And so with that, I am now going to turn it over to Shaun Daughtery to lead us off. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Josh, to Dr. Sands, to Dr. Martinez, to the university, this whole community for having us here today. I'm excited to be here. And I think we've organized the three of us in ways that go from sort of, I feel like mine is the most esoteric modeling to much more applied. So I'll try not to get embedded in the weeds too much. But the way I come at this was I was a high school teacher and administrator. I saw a lot of how students' participation in school impacted the experience they were having, how their experience impacted whether or not they came to school. And so my interest in this is from applied. Oh, sorry, I went dark here and I thought maybe the whole thing. Yeah, and so I come at it from an interest from a practice standpoint, but I'm also started really thinking about it in terms of early warning systems have been proliferating across the country. And inside of those models, inside those systems, are these sort of automated models that use administrative data to make decisions and suggestions about what schools and districts should be doing. And as someone who thinks a lot about quantitative measurement and modeling, I was concerned that some of the assumptions that may be made in these models might be masking what's really going on behind the scenes. So Dr. Child said it already, but I'll mention that this is part of comes out of joint work that we've done in the book that you all just got to see the cover of a second ago. I'm going to focus on just understanding descriptive patterns in using state administrative data. And I'm going to show differences in how absence behavior plays out by age and by free and reduced price lunch status, which is just one coarse indicator that we have in these administrative databases, but shows up as salient, and then talk about how we model attendance and how the definition of chronic absence and differences in how that variable plays out across time and for groups of students would impact how maybe we could think about policy response at the local level. So I've got statewide data across 13 years. It's 11 million student by year observations. It's just really rich in the sense that we feel like we can make pretty generalized statements from such a large data set. It's not nationally representative, and so there could be obviously variation across states, but it's I think a case study that could give us some context. So this figure here is the attendance rate. This is average attendance rate across grade level in school, and it's differentiated by students who are not free lunch eligible and those that are free lunch eligible. And what you can see is that there's always a difference in the average attendance rate across grade level, that on average, lower income students are attending fewer or a slightly smaller share of days of school, but that also notably later in school, students are coming less frequently. Right? So if you work in schools, this probably more or less jives with your priors or what your lived experience. It certainly does with mine. And you see this notable shift down that occurs in 9th grade. And we know that transitions across schooling levels can be particularly sensitive times in terms of development, but then also in terms of absence behavior. So one thing that stands out to me is that if we're thinking about chronic absence by definition is going to occur much less frequently in elementary school, where general levels of absence are lower. Even when they're high, they're lower than in high school. And so from a policy standpoint, if we have a district-wide or statewide model that really thinks about just a universal definition of chronic absence, the way we think about monitoring and early intervention or responding to family need should be systematically different in elementary schools than it should be in high schools, not just because developmentally children and families are at different points in their experience with schooling, but also because the actual manifestation of attendance behavior is substantially different. Here, this one question is is 18 days the right number of days, or is 10% of days the right number of days to define chronic absence? Most other studies have shown that this threshold is not sort of a magic place, that how we think about measuring this doesn't change substantially across that number of days. And this graph more or less bears that out, that it's for higher and lower income students, chronic absence, the share of students who are defined as chronically absent based on the percentage of days present. So in some sense, maybe we would worry that this 10% rule is magic. It's not magic. So that gets me to the next point about what measure we use matters less than this kind of definition of chronic absence. And probably it matters more that the behavior is systematically different across grades in school. And this, the formatting gets off slightly, but in general, this shows whether you're using attendance rate, days absent, or a binary measure of chronic absence, we always see difference in levels by family income, and so it just underscores we know there are these structural differences in how students are received into schools, into access to services and community, and into the experiences students are having in schools, that again suggests this is not a function of how we're measuring attendance. This plays out pretty universally, at least in this one state. It gets a little wonky here, but I just want to point out again that what measure we use matters, and how we're going to model attendance will have implications for how we measure it. So if we, in the upper left-hand corner here, I just have a count of absences and the relative density, right? So lots of kids are absent 0 days or very few days. But it's, you can't be absent fewer than 0 days unless you make a coding mistake. But you can't be absent more days than there are in the school year. But the distribution is really sort of bounded between 0 and 25. The thing is, if we just use ordinary least squares regression model to model this, it gets it wrong. You can't see it on this graph, but it predicts a lot of negative days of absence, which is not possible. And then so we have alternative models for doing this, a Poisson model or a negative binomial model where the distributional assumptions are more like what the actual data look like. And this is a fine-grained point, but really emphasizes that if we're going to use absences and we're going to have systems that use absences and try and model early warning systems, we need to be applying the right approach. And so if this is being done at a localized level where people on average should not have 5 years of PhD level quantitative training, we should have systems to support the creation of models that model this appropriately. The same sort of applies if we use attendance rate. This is now the share of total days you were in school divided by the total number of days that your school actually was in session. The distribution looks quite different. And again, if we use a linear model, it sort of forces the distribution to look, normally distributed, when in fact it shouldn't look normally distributed. It's this skewed distribution. And so using models that take into consideration, again, you can't be present more than 100% of the time. We should take into consideration, like with absences, not being able to be absent less than 0 days, the natural boundaries to these measurements when we model this. So Tobit models and fractional logit models actually perform much better if we're trying to predict the actual attendance rate. And then finally, chronic absence, we just define this as equal to 0 if you're absent fewer than 10% of the days, and equal to 1 if you're at 10% or higher. This is, like as I showed in the earlier descriptive graph, this is not a magic threshold, but again, the model that you use will tend to get it wrong if we use a linear model. logistic regression or probate regression models that, again, take into consideration the sort of natural bounding, or that it's a relative, the real problem is that while we're concerned about high levels of absence, relative to 100% of students, it's still a fairly small share. A group of students for whom we should be concerned about absence behavior, but because it's a relatively small share of students, again, if we try and model it with this binary variable, we're going to get it, on average, we're going to get it wrong for some of the students, what we think their absence behavior really would be. And so I think the big takeaway is, I don't know who's designing models across the country, but if we think about early warning models, who's going to show up in the early warning model as triggering attention based on attendance behavior may be systematically different depending on the model that we're employing. And I would just make a plug for a lot more like common sense early monitoring, saying in elementary school, if there have been 2 absences early on, we probably want to have conversations much sooner than if that's happening in high school, because we just know for the average student, the number of days absent is much lower on average in elementary school. And so 2 days means something different in 3rd grade than it does in 10th grade, right, in the month of September. We also know some schools have really thoughtful approaches to thinking about differences in access. So the elementary school that my kids attended in suburban Hartford were really thoughtful about structural barriers to students getting to school. And so the approach they took was a really supportive one, that if students were absent or late early on in the school year, they tried to reach out to families and ask, are there things that we could do that would help make it easier to get to school? That's why I think we need to attend to these differences, that this is not a revelation, but because it plays out in the modeling world, we need to be aware of differences by family income and grade level. And so, yeah, I just reiterate that monitoring attendance, thinking about periodic thresholds for what constitutes behavior that attendance that we might want to follow up on is going to be different by grade and maybe family income, and that local policies should be really thinking about differentiating, right? I use a state administrative data set for this. If I broke that out into the 3 larger cities in that state and the rest of the state, I think we would also see some differences based on how students are transported to school, other supports in the community. And so just making sure that early warning indicator systems and thresholds for intervention are systematic, are appropriately customized. So with that, I'll cede the floor, and thanks very much for the chance to talk about this.
Thanks, Shaun. Morning, everyone. My name is Kevin G., currently a professor in the School of Education at UC Davis. I just want to thank Dr. Childs, Dr. Jabbar, also the dean, and the chair of your department for having us today. So just to briefly give you sort of my shtick, what do I do in terms of research? I look at intersections between health and education, and I also look at how schools can promote policies and programs to really support kids who experience adversity early in life. And as many of you know, one of the groups that experience a lot of adversity are foster youth. So I come at this project looking at chronic absenteeism through sort of the lens of trying to support kids, especially kids like foster youth, right, who move from school to school a lot. And how do we better support those students? So, I do quantitative work as well as, and Shaun, as you can tell, also does quantitative work. But when I think about my data, I always think about the stories that are behind my data points, right? So we can talk about chronic absenteeism, and we can see in our data whether someone is chronically absent or not. But beneath that data point is a story, and it's usually a story about why they're chronically absent. So if we look at a story like this, I just wanted to start our talk today. This is from a project that was done in Minnesota. They actually have a case management system where they selectively identify kids who are absent more than 9 times. And if they're absent more than 9 times, they will actually assign a caseworker to that family, right? Because as many of you know, absenteeism, it just isn't the story around a kid not wanting to go to school. There are deeper layers, and I think we as researchers need to dig deeper on what those layers are. So if you look at this quote here, right, so this is a caseworker who's interacting with a parent, and the caseworker is reporting that she, meaning the mom, is afraid to drive her kids to school because she works 12-hour overnight shifts, and she's afraid she'll be too tired in the morning to drive them. If she doesn't work, she can't support her kids. So she has to drive them back and forth, so her working is getting in the way of her kids getting to school. So what is this tapping into? I mean, there are multiple issues going on here, right? We have a mom who's working, she's working 12-hour shifts, right? She doesn't want to put her kids in danger, right, when she's driving them, right? So this is, again, absenteeism is not just a story about a kid not wanting to show up, or this is not a story of a parent who just doesn't care about their kid getting education. And I say that a lot, and this sort of reflects what your dean had mentioned. I think some of us tend to hear stories where we have this sort of deficit approach in thinking about absenteeism, right? And somehow sort of blaming the kid or blaming the parent, when beneath sort of the reasons why kids are chronically absent, there are multiple layers and there are multiple stories there. And so that sort of gets to my talk today, which is how do we think about what explains chronic absenteeism? And I'm going to do that sort of on the national level, and I'll provide some sort of data here. So 2 questions that I'm going to be asking in today's talk. What explains chronic absenteeism? And I'm going to be looking at this in early elementary years, and specifically I'm going to be looking at first graders, and I'm going to be using national level data to do this. And what I really want to do is sort out these influences of child factors, right? So is there something unique about the child driving absenteeism? But as we know, there's family level factors, just in that first example. There could be transportation, there could be parental employment issues. And then finally, what's happening at the school level to drive absenteeism? I do want to sort of give a caveat here. What I'm talking about are factors that are associated or related. These are not necessarily causal. But I think this gives us an idea of what are the underlying factors driving absenteeism in early elementary grades. So the second question that I want to look at is, if we can identify those factors and tease those out, how much of absenteeism can we actually explain, right? And factors that help explain more of absenteeism, we can sort of consider those as more important. And I'll give you sort of an example of how that looks. Why do we care about this? So the big so what here. So if we can identify factors, right, if we can isolate child factors, family factors, we actually want to sort of isolate the ones that we can manipulate, right? From a school, perspective, right? There's only so much schools can do, and there's so many resources that you have, right? You have finite resources. So how can we identify the factors that schools can manipulate, okay? It also helps us really prioritize the factors as well. Factors that explain a whole bunch of absenteeism can be considered more important, and we can think of a way to sort of prioritize those factors when we're thinking about interventions or investments in resources to stem absenteeism. Okay? So just to build your intuition behind what I'm trying to do in the work that I've been working on with this. So if we can think of variability in chronic absenteeism, right? Again, I'm using sort of the standard definition of 10% or more of school for any reason. We can think of different kids. I mean, imagine you are all in a classroom, right? This is a pretty large classroom, but each of you have a different sort of probability of being chronically absent, right? So for me, it could be really high, 90%. Actually, that's not me. I was usually the 0% chance. There's also people who have sort of a 50-50 chance, and each of you are going to have a different probability based on your own individual circumstances, how you interact with school, that's going to determine whether you're going to be chronically absent or not. So that's all this variability, right? We have rich variability in that. So say we have a factor like health, right? So again, this is an area that I work in. I'm sure in Texas, there's discussions probably around asthma and absenteeism. That tends to be a huge driver of absenteeism. So we have variability in health, right? Kids are coming in with different sort of health statuses. And this overlap piece is the section, and this is not like based on any hard data, but this gives you the intuition of what I'm trying to do. This gives you the section that sort of health explains in terms of the variability of chronic absenteeism, okay? The more that health overlaps with this variability, the more important it is, or the more that health is really driving chronic absenteeism. And here it's sort of partially overlapping here. Okay, so when I present sort of my findings, you're going to see sort of percentages, right, in terms of that. So you can think of those in terms of the overlaps that I'm trying to sort of tease out. Okay, so let's get to some of the data that I'm using. Again, this is a national level data set. Some of you may be familiar with this data set, especially doc students and some of the faculty here. It's the Early Childhood Longitudinal Study. I'm going to be looking at about 6,800 kids in first grade. Now, you may be asking, why first grade? I like to look at this issue, well, partly because it's driven by the data, but partly because if you think about it, kids missing school at early grades, kindergarten, first grade, that can really have ripple effects down the line, right? If you're missing some fundamental core, interactions that you're having with your peers or teachers or just even basic skills, that can have ripple effects down the line. And then I'm going to be using something called chronic, moderate chronic absenteeism, so whether a child experienced 11 or more absences during the school year. Okay? So that gives you some idea of the data. Let's take a look at the factors, though. So I'm going to be selective about some of the factors, but I'm going to be looking at child-level factors, especially how the kid approaches learning, right? Does the child pay attention? Do they follow rules? Okay. I'm going to be looking at their health, and this is sort of a self-reported health measure based on parental report. Importantly, I'm going to be looking at chronic absenteeism in kindergarten, right? So again, these are first graders, because I want to understand if kids are chronically absent in kindergarten, does that spill over into first grade? Family level factors, I'm going to be looking at parental employment status, and then I'm going to be looking at whether the parent is involved in school, right? I'm sure many of you are thinking, okay, if we can get parents more engaged in school, that might sort of boost their child's propensity of coming to school. And then finally, I'm going to look at sort of classroom and school level factors. Here, in the classroom level, I'm going to be looking at teacher experience and the quality of the teacher, the relationship that a kid has with the teacher in the classroom, the closest, and whether the kid actually has conflict relationship. And then finally, I'm going to be looking at some of these school level factors, right? So I know many of you who are coming in here working sort of at a district level are thinking about what's going on in school, right? Do we have a problem with bullying? Do we have a problem with teacher absenteeism? It's sort of broader school climate issues that may prevent kids from coming to school. Okay, so what are we finding here? So again, I'm showing you these sort of proportions, and so we're looking at sort of child level factors here and how much of the proportion of the variability in chronic absenteeism that I can explain, okay? So a couple of things that I want to highlight for you here. I can explain about 15% of the variability of chronic absenteeism in first grade based on these child level predictors. And as you can see here, the big predictor of absenteeism in kindergarten, in first grade, is actually prior absenteeism, right? So we can explain about 10% of that variability based on their prior absenteeism. In terms of parents are explaining some of the variability, right, in absenteeism, but it's not, a huge amount. It's about 6% of the variability, and then it drops pretty low, right? So classroom, less than 1%, I can explain, and then finally about 1.5% of the variability in chronic absence in first grade I can explain by these school level factors, okay? So when you add all of that up, one thing to note is child level factors tend to drive chronic absenteeism versus parent, and then school, and then finally classroom. A couple of things, when you add it all up, factors together as a whole in the way I've approached this, I can explain about 20% of that variability in chronic absenteeism, right? And again, remember, we're really interested in identifying factors that explain a larger share of the variability. About half of that is driven by prior chronic absenteeism, and I'll talk about some of the implications of that. Some of you may be asking, what about the other 80%? What about the other 80%? These are factors that I haven't necessarily captured. They remain unobserved, okay? So a couple of takeaways here. I know I have a couple minutes, so I'll try to do this like a minute apiece here. So a couple of takeaways from this work. First one is multiple factors work in combination, right, to explain absenteeism, right? So there is no sort of silver bullet in many cases. So what's the implication? Chronic absenteeism is a holistic challenge, right? And it's going to require holistic solutions as well, right? So it's just not going to be that one single intervention that targets this one factor. It's going to be multiple things. Let me just show you briefly sort of how this may work in action. So I know Dr. Childs has worked on this project with Pittsburgh. So they actually have an integrated data system, right? So if it's a holistic challenge, we need to understand the multiple factors that contribute to that. And I think one way to do that is with high quality data that merges data from different sort of sources, right? So Pittsburgh is using data not only from education, but human services, public housing, juvenile justice, right? I do some work with alternative ed schools, and this group tends not to show up a lot. Also school district level data. They've also used data from other larger sort of community surveys, police data as well. So again, it's important to sort of think about if we're going to attack chronic absenteeism to sort of look at the multiple factors. We can get that by sort of looking at multiple sources of data. All right. Second big takeaway from my work, if we want to explain absenteeism at the individual level, child factors are helping explain the most, right? Followed by family, classroom, and school. So what does that mean in terms of implications? If you're looking at your overall, I have 1 minute, okay. Your absenteeism rate, you want to start by looking within schools and asking what's happening at the individual student level, right? And this is an interesting model here. So in Sacramento, which is the area that I'm from, they actually have a case management system as well. And what they do is they not only look at what are the pushed out factors of absenteeism, right? So what are the attendance challenges? You can see here one of the top one is physical health. But what are the factors that draw kids into schools? And I don't think we're doing enough thinking about that, right? So it's not only attendance challenges, but the attendance motivators. You can see here, which is an interesting finding, right, is people relationships mattered a lot. And they were surveying students, right? So they asked, what would draw you back into school? And it's really the relationships that they're having with teachers, right, and having with their peers. So again, understand that the factors are both push and pull. And I think we need to do better thinking around sort of these motivating factors. Okay. Tier system of support, Sarah's actually going to cover this. This is a multi-tiered system. It basically, we want to sort of use more individualized or tailored interventions as kids become more chronically absent. Okay. And Sarah's going to cover more of that. Final implication here in the couple seconds that I have left. Prior absenteeism matters the most. So that's one huge takeaway. So efforts at reducing absenteeism in early grades will be critical to prevent absenteeism in later grades. Okay. Quick example here, last example. So Baltimore is actually looking at what's happening in early childhood care participation and whether that links to absenteeism. What I just want to show you on this graph here is if we look at this yellow line, these are kids who participated both in Head Start and pre-K. You'll see here they have the lowest percentage of kids who are chronically absent relative to kids who never participated in any program at all. Okay, so it's going to require also linking and thinking critically about what's happening in terms of our early care system and whether that's supporting our kids. Okay, and thank you. So if you do have questions, happy to entertain them. Thank you.
Thanks, Kevin. Hi, good morning. I'm Sarah Lenhoff from Wayne State in Detroit. I'm really happy to be here. I'm going to be talking to you about the research practice partnership that Wayne State's College of Education has with the large public school district in Detroit, Detroit Public Schools Community District. And chronic absenteeism is a huge problem in Detroit. Josh told us that about 13% of kids nationwide are chronically absent. In Detroit, it's more than half of the students are chronically absent from school. And in DPSCD, it's nearly 70% of kids are chronically absent. So this is a huge, pervasive problem. It sort of counters a little bit of what Shaun said. In Detroit, it really is most of the kids that you really need to address here. And so research that my colleagues and I did it's trying to assess, what does the problem look like? It's all over the city. Obviously, there are pockets where it's less of a problem, but it's pretty pervasive across the city in Detroit. And we found that community factors are really important. So we heard that Kevin talked a lot about child factors, family factors, and school factors. Those things are incredibly important in driving absenteeism in Detroit, but there's also community-based factors. So in new research that we've done, we found that census-tracked percentages of asthma rates, crime, residential mobility, vacancy, which is a big problem in Detroit, transportation access, all of these things affect a child's ability to get to school and therefore require community and school kind of partnerships to work together on this problem. Essentially, the research that others have done, the research we're doing in Detroit, indicates that schools are an essential part of solving the problem of chronic absence, but they're insufficient for doing so. We have to partner with community groups. We have to partner with municipal services, government services to solve this problem. So there's really a kind of a lack of frameworks or kind of organizing structures for doing this kind of partnership work. In Detroit, I think is similar to other cities where there's a lot of community groups working on issues that touch on absenteeism, but they're not coordinated with the school systems typically, right? They're doing one-off programs. In Detroit, we have community groups doing mentorship. We have some community groups who are actually picking up kids and taking them to school to sort of supplement the school transportation system, right? These are important efforts, but not systemic, right? They're not going to solve chronic absenteeism at scale in Detroit. They're certainly not kind of models that you could use in other large cities dealing with this problem. So in our partnership that's now kind of 3 years in, we've seen a need to develop some sort of framework to organize the work between community partners, municipal partners, and the school district to come together around this problem. How can they work in concert to make sure that they're developing a systemic approach that's not duplicating efforts, that has a sort of consistent and coherent theory of action about what the issues are, and a kind of framing organization to work together. So we have attempted to kind of start doing this in Detroit and build some infrastructure to partner. We see sorry, I'm going to go back. We see our research partnership as being a potentially key lever in bringing together these groups. In Detroit, as the research partner at Wayne State, we have kind of unique access to student level data that the community partners typically can't get because they don't have IRB status and all of this. So we can kind of analyze data in real time that helps them in their efforts. We also can bring kind of substantive expertise and researchers from other places to inform their work. And at least in Detroit, we're perceived as sort of a neutral party in a landscape that's really divisive, right? So in Detroit, for instance, half of the students go to charter schools, half go to the traditional public district. There's a lot of kind of political infighting in the education system, and Wayne State is sort of seen as kind of a neutral party in all of that. So if we're facilitating collaborations between groups, it's seen as we don't have an agenda about, you know, governance and that kind of thing, and it really helps in those dynamics. So previous work that I've done has looked at kind of models for school improvement, particularly around instructional reform, but also kind of comprehensive reform, that have advocated for this more kind of developmental approach to evaluation, where seeing the value of kind of a sophisticated quantitative work, you know, once a program is off the ground, that's really important. But as we know, we don't have systemic approaches, proven models of reform and chronic absence. We're really building those as we're trying to implement them. And so developmental evaluation is a potential kind of method of evaluating what's working in real time. So we collect data and we share it back to our school district and community partners in real time to help them evaluate. And many of you might be familiar with continuous improvement methods that use things like rapid cycles of improvement, PDSA cycles, right? We use those in our work to help the district and community partners kind of understand what's working, what's not, how they can adapt. And so in this study, we sort of use developmental evaluation as a key kind of leverage point to bring community and school district partners together. The evaluator, that's us. We were part of the RPP with the district. The findings from developmental evaluation were used to inform their kind of continuous learning about chronic absence. And then community and school actors are in the midst of right now kind of co-constructing a model for reform in Detroit. So just a little background. Can someone give me a timer? How many? What?
6 minutes.
I have 6 minutes. Okay, good. Okay, so in Detroit, as I mentioned, we have all these community actors who are working on chronic absence. About 5-6 years ago, they sort of started reading research. Attendance Works came on the scene and said, this is a really big problem. We need to do something about it. At the time, an emergency manager was running the schools. They didn't have infrastructure at central office to really address this. So community partners really started filling in the gap and doing things on their own, right? They didn't have a formal partnership with the district. Over time, they started building relationships with central office, but it wasn't formalized. It was more like, okay, we know somebody in the data office, maybe he can give us some information, or we know somebody who has, you know, in this particular area of the city who might have influence over some principals. It was very scattered. And so through this partnership work, we essentially helped them form a formal help these community groups form a formal partnership with the school district, in which they piloted an intervention together and allowed us to sort of use developmental evaluation to help them learn as they implemented. And that's the focus of the case study I'll share today that sort of lays the groundwork for this framework for collaboration that I'll talk about. So, okay, so the research questions for this study were how are continuous improvement methods kind of taken up and perceived by these diverse stakeholder participants? And how do they act on that learning in the developmental evaluation? And kind of what opportunities and challenges do using these methods kind of produce when introduced within kind of this multi-sector coalition? So as Kevin mentioned, the idea behind this initial reform was that all the schools in this pilot were implementing a tiered system of supporting students. So the first tier is kids who aren't chronically absent. Second tier is kids who are missing 10 to 19% of days. And tier 3 is kids who are missing 20% or more. They focused their intervention on this middle tier. So kids who are just chronically absent, middle school kids they wanted to target, with the idea being okay, middle school kids have a little bit more autonomy. Maybe they're, making some decisions about getting to school, but it's before high school when we see the problem really get bad. And maybe if we can sort of get kids more engaged in school in this moment, they'll have better attendance later on. So this was their theory of action. They wanted to create a really engaging, super fun after-school program that incentivized kids coming to school. So the kids couldn't go to after school if they didn't go to school. And they had attendance teams in each of these 6 pilot schools basically target kids into this after-school program with the idea that they would have improved socio-emotional outcomes and attendance. So as we do in qualitative work, we collect lots of data to sort of triangulate our findings, and as part of the developmental evaluation process, we wanted to collect data from kind of all people in the system, right? So we conducted 3 student surveys. We interviewed program staff and community partners, attendance team members in each of the school and principals. And then we collected school enrollment and attendance data, program enrollment and attendance, and we did 40 hours of observation. So this is just one little piece of this developmental evaluation. I don't have time to get into kind of all of the aspects of it, but they implemented PDSAs with the data that we were sharing with them. They realized through the surveys that they weren't identifying the right kids for the program. So most of the kids in the program weren't actually chronically absent. Right? Really disappointing when they find this out. But they created kind of an action plan for how are we going to actually target the kids that we want to. And it also was useful information to them because they realized that most of the Tier 2 kids in this school were missing for things like health, and appointments and family obligations, which frankly an engaging after-school program is not going to solve, right? If you're missing school not because you don't want to come to school, but because you have other things going on, it's not going to make a huge difference. So it was really generative for them in thinking about, okay, we'll continue to do this, but then what's our next thing? And then their work in their first cycle led them to work in their second PDSA cycle when they found out that of the kids they had recruited, they weren't coming very often, right? I mean, there were just a handful of kids who were coming every day, and so they thought about how do we tweak kind of the engagement protocol, how do we make sure that it's working the way we want it to. So, great. So developmental evaluation, we are finding can be a catalyst for continuous improvement in this space and bringing together partners across these sectors to work on a critical problem of practice. We see this as a key kind of source of collaboration on chronic absence, but also other issues that touch on kind of community and municipal issues. So for instance, in Detroit, student mobility is a really big problem. About 30% of the kids switch schools when they don't have to every year, right? And that's a problem that schools themselves can't solve on their own, right? So we are kind of building this framework for community, family, school, continuous improvement, engagement on these critical problems in which, there's these mini initiatives going on in the school space, in the community space, in the municipal space. How do we bring them together to sort of begin learning about what's working and what's not so that they can build a systemic approach to addressing this critical problem? And we see this as an example of how this might work. So in Detroit, this work that we did last year with the developmental evaluation has now created a kind of foundation for a networked improvement community that's bringing these partners together. We're meeting monthly. This is their goal that they just decided on last month. Actually, community stakeholders in the school district will partner to continuously improve a systemic approach to holistically engaging students, thereby mitigating chronic absence. So sort of acknowledging that it's not about, chronic absence is a symptom of the problem of not adequately addressing student engagement and supporting students. So I'm very excited to be here, and I'm excited to hear from the community partners who are here as well. Thank you so much.
So before I invite two of my fabulous community partner colleagues, a quick thing. One is after this session for students in the College of Education, There'll be a lunch provided for you to be able to engage further with our 3 out-of-town guests here in this room. Lunch will come up shortly after this is finished. Also, too, this is being recorded, so it'll be on the College of Education's YouTube page, so you'll be able to pull us up and see the slides. I'm sure our presenters will be happy to share those as well. And I had one other thing, but I forgot, so we'll just move on. And so I want to invite both Bertha Arlano, Administrative Supervisor for Dropout Prevention and Recovery, Attendance and Truancy of Austin ISD, to join me up in the front. And then also to Sonia Dominguez, Senior Director of Learning Networks for E3 Alliance. I'm going to pose them 2 questions, kind of capturing today's talk. And then after they're finished, I'll somewhat come back up, and then we'll turn over to you for our remaining time to ask anyone questions. So Sonia and Bertha, if you'll come up, you can stand on like either side. Thank you.
Yeah.
Good morning.
Either way, it's not about me.
Good morning. First of all.
Good morning.
So first question, what are some of the things your respective organizations, Austin ISD and the E3 Alliance, are doing to help combat or curb chronic absenteeism?
I'll let my friend go first.
Yes, I'm Bertha Ariano, and yes, we have, for those of you who aren't familiar with Austin ISD, we have about 80,000 students in our district, and our overall attendance rate is 95% year after year, about the last few years. And I loved a lot of exactly what you guys were saying. We've been trying and doing and trying to hit on the right thing, especially when you think about the map of Detroit and kind of those grayer, light gray, darker gray. We are in that, we probably have, ours would look different, but we do have different student populations in our district, different schools. And so as we try to work with our campuses, we have to think about that. How are we going to work on chronic absenteeism at each school and using data, pushing data? And one of the things with E3, Sonia had, what was that? The presentation you had on chronic absenteeism about a year and a half ago, I think. And they talked about how 30% of the absences are actually created by about 10% of the students. And we're like, wow, that's interesting information. So how can we use that data to push our campuses to look at it that way? And is it accurate for AISD? So we went, my partner in crime over there, Nissa O'Connor, is our coordinator. And we've been working together for several years, and so we took the data. We had about 20 middle schools, and we said, let's look at the 20 middle schools. It was February. Let's see where this stands. And by hand we did it because that was a manageable number, and we were going to meet with the principals and share that information with them. And it was true. It was very accurate. And not only
Thank God. I'm glad we gave you accurate data.
And when you present to different groups, you're like, oh, what's going to work? What's going to click? That clicked for them. They really liked it. They're like, oh, I can and we gave them the kids' names. And on the flip side, they also learned there were a ton of kids with really great attendance. A lot of kids with 100% attendance, 97, 98, 99. And so it was great news both way, right? Here are the kids you really need to work on, take back and work on with your campus resources. Here are the kids in between, and then here are the kids who are doing great. What are we doing for them? How are we rewarding their great behavior for doing the right things? So, and we can't do that data every day or on the spot. So then we have an advanced case management system, electronic case management system, that we were able to ask the programmers, hey, can you put this data in here for us? And now we have ranges. We have a bar graph that tells kids with 90 to 100%, here's how many kids on your campus fall within that, and then 80 to 89, and then going backwards, and then we capture 0 to 59% together. And of course, when we now have a training that's called Attendance Matters for improving campus ADA at tiers 1, 2, and 3, and there are 3 different workshops, a couple of hours each, or 3 hours each, for campuses to come as a team and look at the data and figure out where is your tier 1, where is your tier 2, where is your tier 3, and how are you responding to them? Because as the researchers said, each campus is different. You have different income levels, you have a different population, and how are you going to address that? And we don't focus so much on the differences, just, what's your plan as in encouraging them. Sonia started at E3 when she started over there an attendance summit, and a big part of what she pushed was coming as a team. Come as a team to train and work on this problem together. And we also have graduation coaches at some of our campuses. That really helped push people to come as a team instead of saying, oh, this is a grad coach's problem to address attendance on the campus. Instead, it became more of a team effort. And we have seen some positives from this training this year. We started this fall, and we're continuing this spring. After our first round of Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3 training, we asked we invited everybody back who had come to those sessions to come talk about obstacles, what things went well, share ideas, and all of that went really well. It was a good session that Nacelle led, and we had good feedback from that training. And so, but I feel like a lot of what we're doing too has been influenced by what we're doing with a lot of the work with E3, and has helped us push, especially getting the data and information that we didn't have, time to prepare or access to that she was.
Right. So I love what Sarah talked about earlier, because at E3 we serve as a P16 education collaborative for Central Texas, and our mission is to use data to drive action, right? So how do we make changes at the systems level? And but we have to rely on our partners to do so. So we have this amazing data, but without these partnerships, without partnerships with the school districts, with actual school principals, with the health sector, with all of our adjacent sectors, we cannot do this work alone. So we have a multi-pronged approach to tackle chronic absence in Central Texas. So I'll touch on the three things that we do. We have what's called Missing School Matters. It is a regional task force made up of all of our school district partners in this region, which is about 15 partners. We also have folks from the Precinct 1, so we have some folks from the court system. We're hoping to get some health folks involved as well. But I just want to give kudos to Bertha and to Rocky. If you raise your hand, Rocky, they are the co-chairs for that Missing School Matters Task Force. It was founded in 2008. It's just created this regional alignment around chronic absence. And so that's part of our job as the backbone organization, is how do we bring folks together to address this issue, and how do we provide the right data so that they can make decisions at their local school districts and even at the campus level around interventions. So that's one approach. The other approach is an attendance summit that we launched 2 years ago, and this is a one-day summit for all of our partners. It started with just Central Texas school districts, and what we asked them to do was bring your campus team. Bring your principal, your assistant principal, your attendance clerk, whoever is in charge of supporting attendance efforts, your parent support specialist. Bring them. It's a full day of learning. We break it out into sessions and highlight best practices that are happening across the area. And I'm happy to say that we're in our third year, planning our third year this year, and now we're getting, actually having people attend from across the state. So what started as a regional effort and a one-day kind of let's all collaborate and share best practices is now turned into hopefully a statewide effort, and we're really excited about that. And the last approach that I'll talk about is something that Sarah talked about. So we are using continuous improvement, where E3 is actually creating what we call a learning networks toolkit or playbook. So we are thinking about that at the school level. So we launched this year a peer learning network focused on chronic absence. So we brought together 10 schools from across 4 different school districts, school teams, who are using PDSA cycles to test and rapid cycle improvement first of all, I'll back up, root cause analysis. So they actually interviewed their kids, and they came back with that data and said, oh, wow, we actually asked our kids. We've never done that before. We asked our kids why they were absent, and I'm thinking, great, that's a first step to figuring out what we can do to better support and target interventions. And so now we're about mid-year through the learning network, and what I hear from these folks, from these campus teams is, okay, so we tested something, it didn't work. Our group was too large. And so we always talk about small tests of change. Test at N of 1 if you can. Then start scaling and start accelerating interventions based on your data. So it's really using, again, that continuous improvement approach and lens. And the other thing that we're focusing on is the race equity lens. So we see the disparity gaps at each campus and at our school districts. So how are we targeting support for that group of students? So how are we supporting our African American males, if that's your target population? What kinds of needs do they have in terms of attendance, and how are you targeting those needs? So really, again, focusing on student needs, focusing on leveraging your strengths and your assets, including community partnerships. How can you do that better? And so this partnership has been amazing, and all the other school districts that are here. All of our partners here, thank you for being here. We really appreciate you. But I think a lot of that has happened because of this partnership. Both our former teachers, school administrators, district administrators have worked together at the school district level. So it's great to have people that you can rely on and you trust to be able to share that data and to be able to have those difficult conversations around what can we do. You know, if you do have a principal or an administrator that does have more of a deficit thinking around chronic absence, how do we shift that and how do we have that courageous conversation?
And I think, too, when you started the Peer Learning Network, the district's campuses had to apply and get superintendent's buy-in and sign off on it. And I think that is really key when you're jumping into something to look for those small tests of change, and are they going to have the follow-through and the buy-in to really do it, especially because you're pulling them off campus. Or at times she has webinars and you're on campus, but is the whole team going to be really committed to participating in all of those different events throughout the year?
And thanks to Attendance Works, they are our partners for
Yes.
the Learning Network, and they provide expertise to our school team, so that's amazing.
So I'm gonna ask this final question, get a quick answer from you
We'll answer
both.
quickly.
I can't be in the College of Education when I ask you a research question. So what are some ways research can help to inform practice and policy, and what are some things you would want us researchers in the room to know or help provide more insight when it comes to the work you are doing on the chronic absenteeism? So actually, let's skip the first part. Let's just focus on what are some things you would want researchers to know or help provide more insight when it comes to the work that you are doing on chronic absenteeism?
I'll start this, is that okay?
Yeah.
So there's a lot of great research. Kevin, Sarah, lost your name?
Shaun.
Shaun. How do we get that research to our practitioners? How? The research is out there, but how do we get it to our folks that are on the ground? That would be my first question, is how do we bridge that gap? How do we make sure that the work is being informed by the research that is out there, and the information that you all shared today is a first step. Having practitioners here, I think, is another step, making sure that we're connecting in that way. And then I'll let you go.
And then I would say it would be fantastic to even as we share the research, to be thinking about the tiers and what we've seen be successful at tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. And I do just living it and working it for many, many years, the idea of different school, I don't want to say profile in a negative way, but just the different criteria that describe a school can have an impact on how you address attendance, right? And so I really appreciated that piece being a part of the research. And then the next question is, okay, so then how do we respond differently to that, and what is effective? And then how do we, it's almost like that checklist of, here's how you get started, here are the key components that you need to make sure you do from that leadership on the campus who did make this happen. Please share those details with us too, because it's making it actually happen, and the step-by-step of what key pieces were there, that if you don't have them, then, you know, it's not going to be successful or be able to be replicated. And so that would be, and this is fantastic to be able to have these conversations, and so more of this, I think, is important.
So let's thank Bertha and Sylvia.
Thank y'all. Thank you.
So we have just a few minutes, so questions for anyone. I am saying questions, not comments. So questions, comments can be for after. I will Sandman you like the Apollo if you start getting the commentary. So questions, please.
I just have a question about the Detroit context. Is there, what do you feel like some of the reasons for such a big difference between the charter school chronic absenteeism and the traditional public school?
I think some of it is data quality, honestly. I mean, I think that explains some of it. I think the other thing is we've seen that basically opting in from other contexts and in Daughtery, opting into charters like takes more effort. There's more, like, the research has shown that kind of parents are more committed to sort of staying in that school, and so you already have to kind of jump through some hoops to get in. So we think that there might be some dynamics there. And then, you know, the charters, there are some charters in Detroit that have been addressing this issue kind of long before the district. So as I said, the district was sort of lacking any kind of infrastructure because of state takeover and financial troubles and all kinds of things that have really created a void in infrastructure at the central office to manage these issues.
Yes, please.
Well, so for Dr. G, I was just wondering, for some of your factors that you were looking at, like the child approaches
Yep.
to learning, how you constructed that variable, or what you kind of drew to create that?
Yeah, so as you may be familiar with this, the data set I'm using is sort of, it's a national level data set, and so they have sort of, you know, valid, reliable measures of that. And we can talk more about sort of the specific approaches to learning sort of tool that they use to get at that measure.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a great question.
Yes, please.
For you, Dr. G.
Yes.
When you were talking about the factors,
Yep.
broken down by the child and the family and whatever,
Yeah.
and you spoke about prior absenteeism.
Yeah.
In my mind, I'm thinking like that's connected to the parent, especially at that age. How much of that do you think is a lack of us educating the parent on the effects of absenteeism?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when I present this work, I always get the question, like, these kids are so young, so how much of this is in sort of the control of the individual child? I think at that age, definitely, I think the parent is a piece of it, but again, not in a blaming sense, but more of what's going on contextually in the parents' lives that is driving this, right? And if they need social support, if they need transportation support. And again, you know, this is where we need to think about the solutions, again, holistically around this. And that's difficult. It's a difficult conversation to have as well, because it sort of, it pushes the boundaries of what schools are responsible for. And I'm sure you encounter that as well. Right? How can we take care of health, transportation? And in fact, we were in Boston presenting, and they realized some of their high school kids didn't show up to school because of the lack of clean clothes. And so they put in washing machines. Right? Now, they wouldn't have known that unless they actually talked to their kids about why aren't you showing up to school. So this idea of saying, let's actually talk to the kids about why you're not showing up to school, and then developing solutions around that. But your point, you're just right on point about like how much of this is really driven by the kid. I would say for young kids, we do need to look at the parent context. And that means talking to parents. You know?
Madeline, and then, yeah.
So my question is also for Dr. G. So I think that, if I remember correctly, prior absenteeism explained about half of the figure.
Yeah, about 10%.
Yeah, or of the
Of what I could explain,
right.
Yeah, it's explaining about half of that.
Is that above and beyond the other factors like health? So, for example, could health have explained that prior absenteeism, which then?
It could have. That's a great question as well. Yeah, what's driving that prior absenteeism? So there's inputs into what's happening in kindergarten as well. So a piece of that could be sort of health at early ages as well. Yeah, I haven't done the analysis to sort of even back up into that, but that's just good.
Yes, please.
I think it may be a general question of all, but like we've said, we see the trends that prior absenteeism, especially in the early educational grades, we see that make a huge impact in even the data showed earlier in high school. So I guess my question would be, so we didn't catch them early, so what can we do at a high school level systematically, or even with the data, or however we're seeing that, to make that shift? You know, what is it that our educational system or our campuses individually could have some ideas around that? Because we have the data, we see the trends, now what? We've missed some, so how do we impact the ones that we did miss, and then improve at the beginning as well?
I think so much of it's going to be differentiated by like why we think these particular high schools are missing school. Like the suburban Philadelphia district that I worked in was big geographically by Pennsylvania standards, and I think like some older high school age youth had younger siblings, and based on their parents' working schedules, they would get their younger siblings on the bus, which meant they missed their high school bus, and they had no way to go 15, 20 miles to get to the high school, even late. right? So they would just not come, or they got dinged for being late, so they would just not come. So I think in that instance, we could think about a very specific solution that would be different than in Boston if students are predominantly taking public transportation, about whether or not they're actually getting their Metro cards or.
I know we talked about data throughout this whole forum, and the question that kind of came to mind was, if we know how bad our absence, well, how terrible at this point, the topic of absence is in the state of Texas, and we know that other states, because I've worked in education for almost 10 years, with different districts and charters, and all I hear from people that come from other states that say, oh my God, we did not know that this is how bad education was in Texas. And I'm thinking, why have we never compared all that data with what other states are doing differently? And starting with our SIS systems, our student information systems. Obviously, there's so many out there. If we see a pattern that a specific district is using in successful, states when it comes to education, why can't we implement that here? Or has anyone ever done that we're aware of? Or how can we go about, suggesting that?
Data is very political.
I know,
This is on paper. This is on paper. It's walled off even from researchers, and I get it. So I think it's cultivating that sort of culture of data use at the local level. I mean, to the extent to which, again, I see chronic absenteeism as a very sort of local level issue, and so the extent to which you can use sort of local level resources. And again, I know schools don't have a ton of resources to do surveying or focus groups or whatnot, but I think that's a piece of trying to sort of get at this data piece. I think on the broader scale, though, getting state level data, again, in fact, California just released this new dashboard data, if you have time to look at it, on chronic absenteeism. Still, though, that masks, I think, a lot of variation in it, and then to the point you made around targeting subgroups. I also like to think of this in terms of intersectionality of issues. So it's just not African American men. It's probably African American men plus other things going on. And so, yeah, I mean, in California, we focus on homeless youth, we focus on English language learners, foster youth, and it's just not that one group. It's not foster youth. These are foster youth who are low SES, students with disabilities. And so I think it's also thinking about chronic absenteeism from sort of an intersectional standpoint. And that's difficult. That's where the hard work comes in.
The other piece I would add is the funding is different
Yeah.
in different states, right? So like the way we fund our schools relies on attendance and average daily attendance. Not every state uses that formula. So there's some differences in that.
So if you will join me in thanking Sonia Dominguez, Bertha Arlello, Dr. Sarah Lenhoff, Dr. Kevin G., and Dr. Shaun Daughtery. Thank you also to the folks from the College of Education, University of Texas. Those in the community, thank you so much for coming to the 40 acres, finding parking, most importantly, and coming up here. I'm going to leave their papers over here on this desk over here. Also, the book comes out later this month, Absent in School. Pick it up. It should be great. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Jamie, for keeping time. See you all. Have a good weekend.